The discovery. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, golden sands rippling under the harsh sun like waves frozen in time. Daniel Cross wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood at the edge of a shallow pit he had dug over the past few days. He had been following a faint signal picked up by his equipment, a signal that shouldn't exist in the middle of nowhere. Just a little more, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from the dry air. The faint hum of his scanner beeped steadily, urging him to keep going. Daniel wasn't a treasure hunter or adventurer. He was an archaeologist with a stubborn streak and a fascination for the unknown. But this, whatever lay beneath these sands, felt like more than just a routine find. After hours of digging, his shovel hit something solid. A hollow metallic thud echoed in the air, completely unlike the sound of stone or bone. His heart skipped a beat. Carefully, Daniel swept away the sand with his hands, revealing a smooth silver surface. Strange symbols covered it, glowing faintly in a soft blue light. The symbols didn't look like anything from Earth. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling with both excitement and fear. He reached out to touch the surface, but as soon as his fingers brushed it, the glow pulsed brighter. A faint vibration passed through his body, making his hair stand on end. The metallic structure felt warm, almost alive, beneath his fingertips. The sand around the object shifted, sinking slightly as if the discovery itself was causing the desert to react. Daniel pulled back, watching in awe as the strange object began to reveal more of itself. It wasn't just a box. It was a sealed tomb, a strange capsule buried deep beneath the sands. Daniel stepped back and grabbed his journal, hurriedly sketching the symbols and writing down notes. This could be ancient, or alien, or both, he thought. His fingers trembled as he jotted down his observations. The air around him felt heavier, charged with a strange energy that made his heart race. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, Daniel's curiosity overpowered his caution. Using his tools, he searched for a way to open the capsule. A faint groove ran along its edge, suggesting it could be pried open, but every attempt to force it failed. Frustrated, he sat down, staring at the glowing symbols. They seemed to shift slightly when he moved, as if alive. "What are you hiding?" he asked aloud, his voice echoing in the stillness. As night fell, the desert came alive with its usual sounds, howling winds, the distant call of nocturnal creatures. But tonight, something felt different. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath Daniel's feet seemed to hum faintly. He shivered, unsure if it was from the temperature or the growing sense of unease. Suddenly, the symbols on the capsule flared brightly, lighting up the pit like a beacon. Daniel stumbled back, shielding his eyes. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground. It was as if the capsule was waking up after centuries of silence. A crack appeared along its surface, and the glowing symbols began to shift into patterns Daniel couldn't decipher. The crack widened, releasing a faint mist that smelled metallic and unfamiliar. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted in place. He watched, mesmerized, as the capsule slowly began to open. Inside, wrapped in what looked like shimmering fabric, lay a figure. At first, Daniel thought it was a corpse, its skin pale and flawless, its features sharp and otherworldly. But then he noticed the faint rise and fall of its chest. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't dead. Daniel hesitated. He had spent his life chasing mysteries, but this was something far beyond what he had ever imagined. Reaching out with trembling hands, he touched the figure's arm. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a lightning storm. He gasped, falling backward. The figure's eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural light. Daniel froze, staring at the alien being before him. It turned its head slowly, its gaze locking onto his. Its expression was unreadable, but its presence was undeniable. Powerful and ancient, yet vulnerable. The capsule, the desert, The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Who are you?" Daniel managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The figure didn't respond with words, but its glowing eyes seemed to pierce through him, studying him as if searching for something. The ground trembled again, and a distant rumble echoed across the dunes. Daniel looked around, realizing too late that whatever he had awakened wasn't going to stay hidden anymore. Something was coming, and he had no idea if it was a rescue or a threat. The awakening. The desert winds howled, carrying the faint hum of the capsule as it vibrated against the sand. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The figure inside the capsule had opened its eyes, glowing orbs of pale blue that seemed to pierce the darkness around them. For a long, tense moment, it didn't move. It just stared at him, its gaze unnervingly steady, as though it were trying to decide if he was friend or foe. Then it moved. The figure's fingers twitched first, curling slightly against the shimmering fabric that wrapped its body. Daniel stumbled backward, barely keeping his balance as the figure sat up slowly. The motion was fluid, deliberate, every movement exuding an eerie grace. The shimmering material slid off, revealing a tall, slender form clad in some kind of armor that gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Her. Yes, Daniel realized it was a her. Features were sharp and elegant, her skin an unearthly pale silver. She spoke, her voice soft but commanding, the words flowing like music, but completely incomprehensible to him. Daniel raised his hands, palms out, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "I don't understand," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, her glowing eyes narrowing, as if she were analyzing him. The capsule's glow began to fade, and the hum it emitted grew quieter. But the air around them remained charged, as though the energy that had revived her hadn't fully dissipated. The woman placed a hand on the edge of the capsule and stepped out, her movements light and deliberate, as if testing her strength. She towered over Daniel, her presence both intimidating and mesmerizing. Before Daniel could speak again, the ground trembled violently. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, and he turned to see the sand shifting unnaturally around them. Massive shapes began to emerge from beneath the dunes, sleek, mechanical constructs that gleamed in the moonlight. They looked like machines, their spindly legs digging into the sand as they moved with eerie precision. Daniel started, but the woman grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She said something again, her tone sharp and urgent, but he still couldn't understand her. She pointed toward the horizon, where the faint outline of a rocky outcrop was barely visible in the distance. "You want me to run?" he guessed, but she didn't wait for an answer. She pulled him along, her strides long and swift, forcing him to stumble after her. Behind them, the machines began to move faster, their glowing red eyes fixed on the pair. Daniel's mind raced as they ran, the adrenaline making it hard to think clearly. Who was she? What were those machines? And why did they seem so intent on catching her? And, by extension, him. He glanced back and saw one of the machines fire a beam of red light that scorched the sand where they had been standing moments ago. "Great, they're armed," he muttered to himself. He glanced at the woman. "Any chance you have a plan?" She didn't answer, but the determined look in her eyes told him she wasn't planning on giving up. The rocky outcrop loomed closer, and Daniel could see an opening, a narrow cave that might provide some cover. The woman seemed to notice it too, her pace quickening as they reached the base of the rocks. She shoved him inside first, then turned and extended her hand toward the machines. What happened next left Daniel speechless. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and a wave of energy burst from her outstretched hand. The wave struck the nearest machine, sending it crashing into the sand in a heap of broken parts. But the effort clearly cost her. She staggered, her breathing labored, before ducking into the cave beside him. Daniel stared at her, struggling to process what he'd just seen. You "You just took that thing down with your bare hands," he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. She didn't respond. Instead, she leaned against the cave wall, her glowing eyes dimming slightly. She looked exhausted, but she still managed to glare at him as if to say, "This is your fault." Okay, Daniel said, raising his hands. "I get it. You're not exactly thrilled about this situation, and neither am I. But we're going to have to work together if we want to survive, all right?" The woman studied him for a moment before nodding once. She pointed to herself and said a single word. Naya straightened, her eyes regaining some of their glow. She placed a hand on his chest, and Daniel felt a strange warmth spread through him. He didn't know what she was doing, but he could tell it wasn't harming him. When she removed her hand, she pointed deeper into the cave, where a faint light flickered. "What's in there?" he asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward the light. As they moved deeper into the cave, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine. He didn't know who Naya was, but one thing was clear. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior, and whatever she was running from was more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. And now he was caught in the middle of it. The chase. The cave was dark, the air thick and cold as Daniel and Naya pressed deeper into its winding corridors. The flickering light ahead of them came from strange crystals embedded in the walls, glowing faintly with an otherworldly blue hue. Daniel couldn't stop himself from staring at them, fascinated despite the danger they were in. "What is this place?" he muttered under his breath, his voice echoing slightly. Naya didn't answer. She was focused, her glowing eyes scanning the walls as if searching for something specific. Her movements were sharp and purposeful, yet there was a weariness to her steps. Whatever energy she had used to destroy the machine earlier had clearly drained her. Behind them, the sound of mechanical legs striking the sand echoed louder, growing closer by the second. Daniel glanced over his shoulder, his pulse quickening. "They're still following us," he whispered. "What do they want? You? Or us?" Naya paused, turning to face him. She pointed to herself, then to him, then clenched her fist and made a circular motion in the air. Her expression was intense, almost desperate, as though she needed him to understand. "You're saying they're after both of us?" Daniel guessed. Naya nodded once, then grabbed his arm and pulled him forward again, urging him to move faster. The cave opened into a larger chamber, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The space was massive, with walls covered in glowing symbols similar to the ones on the capsule. A towering obelisk stood in the center, its surface shimmering with a strange, liquid-like glow. The air buzzed with energy, making the hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stand on end. "What is this place?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. Naya walked to the obelisk and placed her hand on it. The symbols on its surface flared to life, casting the chamber in a pulsating blue light. Daniel shielded his eyes as the light grew brighter, and when he lowered his hand, he saw that Naya's face was lined with determination. The ground trembled violently, and Daniel stumbled. The machines had reached the mouth of the cave. Their metallic screeches echoed through the corridors, sending chills down his spine. Naya turned to him, her glowing eyes narrowing. She pointed to the obelisk, then to him, then made a motion like opening a door. "You want me to do something with this?" Daniel asked, stepping closer to the obelisk. He stared at the glowing symbols, feeling their pull, like they were alive and aware of his presence. Tentatively, he reached out and placed his hand on its surface. The moment his fingers touched the obelisk, a surge of energy shot through him, far stronger than what he had felt with the capsule. He cried out, pulling his hand back, but the obelisk seemed to react to him. Its glow intensified, and the symbols rearranged themselves, forming a swirling pattern. "What is happening?" Daniel gasped, stumbling back. Naya grabbed his hand and placed it back on the obelisk, holding it there firmly. The energy surged again, but this time it felt different, less like a shock and more like a connection. Images flooded Daniel's mind. Stars, planets, battleships, and a race of beings that looked like Naya, their glowing eyes filled with purpose. He saw their rise, their fall, and their betrayal of one of their own, a betrayal that led to her imprisonment beneath the sands. Daniel's vision cleared, and he staggered, his breathing ragged. You were their queen," he said, piecing the fragments together. "They locked you away because you refused to destroy Earth." Naya's expression softened slightly, a flicker of pain crossing her face. She nodded, then turned her gaze to the entrance of the chamber. The machines were close now, their shadows stretching across the walls. Daniel could hear the grinding of their gears and the faint hum of their weapons charging. Naya stepped forward, raising her hand. The air around her shimmered again, and Daniel could feel the energy building. "Wake," he said, grabbing her arm. "You can't fight them alone. You're barely holding on as it is." She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. She didn't need to speak for Daniel to understand what she was thinking. "Do you have a better idea?" Daniel looked around the chamber, his mind racing. His gaze fell on the obelisk, still glowing brightly. "This thing," he said, pointing to it. "It reacts to me. Maybe I can use it. Do you think it has enough power to stop them?" Naya hesitated, then nodded slowly. She placed both hands on the obelisk and looked at him expectantly. Daniel stepped forward and placed his hands beside hers. The moment their hands touched the surface, the obelisk roared to life. A beam of blue light shot upward, striking the ceiling and spreading across the chamber like lightning. The first of the machines burst into the room, its glowing red eyes locked onto them. Naya shouted something, and the obelisk pulsed, sending a wave of energy that knocked the machine backward. But more were coming, their mechanical bodies relentless. "Whatever this thing can do," Daniel said through gritted teeth, "we need it to do it now." The symbols on the obelisk swirled faster, and the energy in the room reached a fever pitch. Daniel felt like his body was on fire, the energy coursing through him overwhelming, yet strangely familiar. Naya's grip on the obelisk tightened, and she closed her eyes, focusing. The machines charged, but before they could reach them, a massive shockwave burst from the obelisk, throwing the machines back and collapsing the entrance to the chamber. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel slumped to the ground, his body trembling from the strain. Naya sank beside him, her breathing heavy. The obelisk's glow dimmed, and the chamber grew still. "What was that?" Daniel managed to say, his voice hoarse. Naya looked at him, her glowing eyes dim but filled with resolve. She pointed to the obelisk, then to him, and finally to the ceiling, where the faint outlines of stars were carved into the rock. "More?" Daniel asked, understanding her unspoken words. "You're saying this was just one fight, and there's more coming?" Naya nodded, her expression grim. Daniel leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was certain: his life was never going to be the same. The alien passed. The silence in the chamber was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the obelisk as its energy slowly faded. Daniel sat slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow. His body ached from the strain of whatever connection he had made with the obelisk. Naya, still kneeling beside him, studied him intently. Her glowing eyes, though dimmer now, seemed to search for something hidden within him. "All right," Daniel muttered, rubbing his temples as if to push away the pounding headache threatening to split his skull. "I think it's about time you explain what's going on. Who are you, and why are those machines after us?" Naya tilted her head, her expression unreadable. She raised her hand, tracing symbols in the air that glowed faintly for a moment before fading. The symbols meant nothing to Daniel, but he could see her frustration growing. She clenched her fists, then suddenly placed her palm against his forehead. Before Daniel could pull away, A rush of images flooded his mind again, more vivid and coherent than before. This time, there was no confusion. He saw Naya standing in a vast, gleaming city that floated above the surface of a desolate planet. Towers of light pierced the sky, and ships as large as mountains hovered above the skyline. She stood at the center of a grand hall, her voice commanding and resolute as she addressed a crowd of alien figures, all of them clad in armor that glowed faintly like hers. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the emotion in her voice, a plea for peace, a call to abandon war. The vision shifted, and he saw her in chains, dragged before a council of her kind. Their faces were hidden behind ornate masks, their voices cold and condemning. A sentence was passed, and Daniel watched as Naya was sealed inside the capsule, her protests silenced as the shimmering material wrapped around her. He could feel her despair, her betrayal, her anger. The images blurred, and new ones emerged. He saw Earth, bright and blue, as if viewed from space. He saw the alien council pointing to it, their gestures filled with malice. And then he saw fire, massive ships descending on Earth, weapons tearing through cities, humanity struggling to fight back. He saw Naya standing against them, her energy burning bright as she defied her people, choosing to protect Earth rather than conquer it. The vision ended abruptly, and Daniel gasped, pulling away from Naya's touch. His head spun, and he struggled to process what he had just seen. You were their queen," he said, his voice shaky. "They turned on you because you wouldn't help them destroy Earth." Naya nodded, her expression somber. She pointed to him, then to the obelisk, then mimicked an explosion with her hands. Daniel frowned, trying to piece together her meaning. "Wait, the obelisk's energy. It's tied to Earth, isn't it? It's some kind of ancient power source. That's why those machines are after us. They don't just want you. They want me because I activated it." Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. She touched his chest lightly, then gestured outward, as if indicating something vast and beyond comprehension. Daniel swallowed hard. "Great. So no pressure, right?" Naya stood and walked toward the obelisk, placing her hand on its surface. The symbols flared briefly, and Daniel saw new images appear, this time projected in the air like a hologram. It showed Earth, surrounded by a fleet of alien ships. A massive figure, clad in armor darker than night, stood at the helm of one of the ships. His presence radiated power and malice. Daniel could tell without being told. This was Naya's greatest enemy, the one who had orchestrated her imprisonment. "Is he coming here?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naya nodded, her jaw tightening. She pointed to herself, then to Daniel, and then drew a line across her throat. Daniel didn't need a translator for that. If this enemy found them, it was over. For a moment, they stood in silence. Daniel stared at the hologram, the reality of their situation sinking in. He was just an archaeologist, a guy with a fascination for old ruins and forgotten relics. He wasn't a soldier or a hero. How was he supposed to stop an alien invasion? But then he looked at Naya, her posture strong despite the exhaustion weighing her down. She had risked everything to save a planet that wasn't hers. She had defied her people, sacrificed her throne, and endured centuries of isolation. If she could fight, then so could he. "All right," Daniel said, pushing himself to his feet. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to stand tall. "If we're going to stop this guy, we'll need a plan. You've been through this before. Tell me what we need to do." Naya raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his resolve. But then she gave a small, approving nod. She walked to the wall of the chamber, where the glowing crystals cast faint shadows. She touched one of the symbols carved into the rock, and a hidden compartment slid open. Inside was a strange device, something that looked like a weapon, but also like it was alive. It pulsed faintly as she picked it up and handed it to Daniel. "What's this?" he asked, turning the device over in his hands. It felt warm, almost like it was responding to his touch. Naya pointed to him, then to the obelisk, then mimicked firing a weapon. "You're saying this runs on the same energy as the obelisk?" She nodded. Daniel exhaled, gripping the weapon tightly. "All right. I'll figure this out. But you better not leave me hanging, okay?" A faint smile touched her lips, and she gestured for him to follow her. The hum of the obelisk faded completely now, leaving the chamber in near darkness. Naya led the way toward another passage, her steps steady despite the weight of the mission ahead. As they disappeared into the shadows, Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of the stars pressing down on him. He had always thought of himself as a man who uncovered the past. Now he realized he was about to become part of the future, a future that might depend on him and the alien queen who had placed her trust in him. Betrayal in the desert. The desert night was colder than Daniel had anticipated, the biting chill of the wind cutting through his thin jacket. He and Naya had managed to slip out of the cavern through a hidden tunnel that led them to the surface, but the vast openness of the dunes offered little comfort. Every sound, every shift of sand, felt like an approaching threat. Naya moved ahead with purpose, her glowing eyes scanning the horizon. Daniel, however, was struggling to keep up. "Do you even need to sleep?" he muttered under his breath, shivering as he trudged behind her. She didn't answer, not that he expected her to. Her focus was unshakable, her steps steady and deliberate. The two of them crested a tall dune, the moonlight illuminating the endless expanse of sand below. Daniel squinted into the distance and froze. There, glinting faintly in the moonlight, were the unmistakable silhouettes of vehicles. Trucks, armored jeeps, and figures moving between them. "Humans," Daniel whispered, his voice tinged with both relief and caution. Naya crouched beside him, her expression tense. She didn't seem to share his optimism. Her gaze lingered on the camp below, her sharp features hardening as she observed the activity. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her. "Okay, listen. I know we're running from killer machines, and you probably don't trust anyone, but those people might be able to help us. At the very least, we could use some water and supplies." Naya turned to him, her glowing eyes narrowing. She gestured sharply toward the camp, then mined a cage with her hands, snapping her fingers shut. Daniel frowned. "You think they'll trap us?" She nodded firmly, her expression leaving no room for argument. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his dusty hair. "Look, we don't have a lot of options here. We're low on supplies. Those machines are still out there somewhere, and you're not at full strength. If they're hostile, we'll figure something out. But right now, we need them." Naya's jaw tightened, but after a long moment, she relented. She motioned for him to lead the way, though her posture remained tense, ready for a fight. As they approached the camp, the hum of an engine broke the silence. A spotlight from one of the jeeps swung toward them, blinding Daniel momentarily. He raised his hands instinctively, shouting, "Hey, don't shoot. We're not armed." A gruff voice called out from the shadows, "Step closer." Slowly, Daniel complied, stepping forward with his hands raised. Naya followed a step behind, her glowing eyes catching the light and making her look even more alien. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the camp as the people got a closer look at her. "Holy, what the hell is that?" one of the men whispered, gripping his rifle tightly. "She's not a what, she's a who," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Her name is Naya. She's with me. We're just passing through and could use some help." The group of mercenaries, or treasure hunters, judging by their ragged clothing and mismatched weapons, exchanged wary glances. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. He had a calculating look in his eyes, the kind that put Daniel on edge. "Passing through, Pa," the man said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And what exactly is she supposed to be?" Daniel hesitated. "It's complicated, but she's not dangerous. We've been running from some kind of machines. They're after us, and if they find us, they'll come here too." The leader's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Naya, who stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on him. Machines, huh? And you think bringing them to us is doing us a favor? No, that's not what I'm saying, Daniel said quickly. We just need some water, maybe a place to rest for a few hours. We'll leave before they show up. The man smirked, his scar tugging at the corner of his mouth. You think I'm stupid? You're not just some random guy wandering the desert. That thing, he pointed at Naya, is worth a fortune. And you've got the look of a guy who's sitting on secrets. Big ones. Daniel's stomach dropped. I don't know what you're talking about. The leader raised his hand, and suddenly the group's rifles were trained on them. Search them, he ordered. Before Daniel could react, rough hands shoved him to the ground. He struggled, shouting protests, but the men were stronger and more numerous. They ripped his backpack away, spilling its contents across the sand. One of them held up the alien weapon Naya had given him, his eyes widening. Boss, you gotta see this, the man said, handing the weapon to the leader. The scared man inspected it, his expression growing greedier by the second. This thing's not from Earth, he said, grinning. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Daniel's jaw tightened. That's not yours. Give it back. The leader chuckled. Oh, it's mine now. And so is she. He motioned to his men, who began circling Naya. She hadn't moved the entire time, but Daniel could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands flexed slightly as if preparing to strike. Don't, Daniel said, his voice low. You don't know what you're messing with. Neither do you, the leader shot back. He turned to his men. Take them both inside. We'll figure out what to do with them after we. He didn't get to finish. Naya moved faster than Daniel thought possible, her body a blur as she struck the nearest man. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Before the others could react, she unleashed a wave of energy that sent them flying. The leader barely managed to dive out of the way, the alien weapon slipping from his hands. Stop her, he shouted, but his men were already scrambling to recover. Naya stood in the center of the chaos, her glowing eyes blazing with fury. Daniel scrambled to his feet, grabbing the weapon and aiming it at the leader. Call them off, he shouted. Now. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between Daniel and Naya. For a moment, the desert was silent except for the wind. Finally, the leader raised his hands. All right. Stand down. The remaining men backed away, their eyes filled with fear. Naya lowered her hands, the energy around her dissipating. She turned to Daniel, her expression unreadable. Daniel tightened his grip on the weapon, his heart still pounding. We're leaving, he said firmly. And if I see any of you following us, I won't hesitate to use this. The leader glared at him but said nothing. Daniel didn't wait for a response. He gestured for Naya to follow, and together they disappeared into the desert, leaving the chaos behind. As they walked, Daniel glanced at Naya. I told you they'd betrayed us. She said nothing, but the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. It seemed for now they had survived, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The final stand. The desert wind howled as Daniel and Naya trudged forward, their silhouettes barely visible under the faint glow of the moonlight. The adrenaline from their escape still coursed through Daniel's veins, but exhaustion was beginning to creep in. His grip on the alien weapon tightened as he glanced over his shoulder. They were alone for now, but the mercenaries and machines were both looming threats, not to mention the ominous presence of Naya's ancient enemy that seemed to draw closer with every passing moment. Naya stopped abruptly, raising her hand to signal silence. Daniel froze, straining his ears to catch what she had heard. A faint hum reached him, barely audible over the wind. It was rhythmic, mechanical, unmistakably the sound of the machines that had been hunting them since the capsule had been unearthed. They're back, Daniel muttered, his voice tight. Naya nodded, her glowing eyes scanning the horizon. She pointed to a jagged outcrop of rocks nearby, motioning for Daniel to follow. Without a word, they scrambled toward it, slipping into the shadows just as the first of the machines crested the nearby dune. From their hiding spot, Daniel could see them clearly. Sleek and menacing, the machines moved with unnatural precision. Their legs, spider-like and jointed, cut through the sand effortlessly, while their glowing red eyes scanned the landscape. There were at least half a dozen of them, each one armed with what looked like mounted energy weapons. They were moving in a formation, clearly searching for something or someone. "That's a lot more than last time," Daniel whispered, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. He turned to Naya. "Please tell me you have a plan." Naya remained calm, her expression unreadable. She crouched low, drawing a symbol in the sand with her finger. The symbol began to glow faintly, and Daniel felt a subtle vibration beneath him. He frowned, unsure of what she was doing. "Is that a signal?" he asked, watching as the glow spread outward like a pulse. Naya nodded, then pointed to herself, then to the obelisk-like weapon Daniel carried, and finally to the machines. "You're saying we can fight them with this?" Daniel asked, holding up the weapon. Naya nodded again, but this time she hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. She placed a hand over her heart, then gestured to him, her expression softening. Daniel's brow furrowed. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. "That we can't win this without me?" Naya nodded, her gaze steady. Then she tapped her chest again, this time more firmly, and gestured to him as if to say, "You're the key." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Fantastic. I'm the key. I didn't sign up for this, you know." He glanced at the approaching machines, his mind racing. "All right. If we're going to do this, we need to even the odds. Can that symbol you drew slow them down?" Naya's lips curved into the faintest smile, and she gave a small nod. She gestured for him to stay put, then slipped out of the rocks, moving like a shadow. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat as he watched her go, her form disappearing into the dark dunes. He gripped the alien weapon tightly, feeling its strange, living warmth against his palms. "You've got to trust her," he muttered to himself. "She knows what she's doing, I hope." The hum of the machines grew louder, their red eyes casting eerie beams of light across the sand. One of them paused, its head swiveling as if it had detected something. It let out a high-pitched whine, and the others adjusted their formation, closing in on Daniel's position. "Come on, Naya," Daniel whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. Now would be a great time to. Before he could finish, the ground erupted beneath the nearest machine. A glowing symbol, identical to the one Naya had drawn, burst into life, sending a pulse of energy through the sand. The machine shuddered violently, its legs collapsing as the energy tore through its circuits. Two more machines were caught in the blast, their movements faltering as they struggled to remain upright. Naya emerged from the shadows, her hands glowing with the same energy as the symbol. She moved with precision, throwing bursts of light that disrupted the machine's sensors and forced them to retreat momentarily. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped out of cover, raising the weapon. "All right, let's see what this thing can do," he muttered. He aimed at the nearest functioning machine and squeezed the trigger, or what he thought was the trigger. The weapon hummed in response, and a pulse of blue energy shot forward, striking the machine dead center. The impact sent it sprawling, sparks flying as its legs twitched uselessly. "Whoa," Daniel breathed, his hands trembling from the recoil. The weapon felt alive, almost like it was guiding his movements. He aimed again, firing another pulse that disabled a second machine. The remaining machines regrouped, their weapons glowing as they prepared to fire. Naya shouted something in her alien language, her voice sharp and commanding. Daniel didn't need a translator to understand. "Get down." He dove behind a boulder as beams of red energy sliced through the air, scorching the sand where he had been standing moments ago. Naya countered with another wave of energy, but Daniel could see the strain on her face. She was reaching her limit. "Hang on, Naya," Daniel shouted, popping up from cover to fire again. His shot struck another machine, but the recoil sent him stumbling backward. The remaining machines focused on him now, their weapons whirring ominously. Just as one of the machines prepared to fire, Naya charged forward, her body glowing with an intense blue light. She let out a fierce cry as she unleashed a massive wave of energy, obliterating the final machines in a single blinding flash. When the dust settled, the desert was eerily silent. Daniel climbed to his feet, his heart pounding. Naya stood in the center of the wreckage, her shoulders heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Her glow had dimmed, and she looked exhausted, but she was still standing. Daniel approached her cautiously, the alien weapon still humming faintly in his hands. "You okay?" he asked. Naya nodded weakly, then gestured to the horizon. Daniel followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. In the distance, more red lights appeared, dozens of them, moving steadily toward their location. "This isn't over, is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naya shook her head, her expression grim. She pointed to the weapon in his hands, then to the glowing horizon, as if to say, "This is just the beginning." A new alliance. The first rays of dawn stretched across the desert, casting a golden glow over the endless dunes. The remnants of the battle lay scattered around Daniel and Naya, shattered pieces of the machines that had been hunting them. But there was no time to rest. The faint hum of approaching engines was already vibrating through the air, a chilling reminder that their enemies weren't far behind. Daniel tightened his grip on the alien weapon Naya had entrusted to him. Its surface pulsed faintly, as though it were alive and feeding off the strange energy coursing through him. He glanced at Naya, who stood tall despite the weariness in her glowing eyes. The faint shimmer of her energy was dimming, her strength clearly waning, yet she exuded a sense of unyielding determination. "They're coming," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. He motioned toward the horizon, where a swarm of red lights crept closer, their mechanical forms barely visible in the distance. "More machines. We can't fight all of them. Not like this." Naya nodded, her gaze shifting to a distant rocky plateau. She pointed toward it and said something in her alien tongue, the words sharp and urgent. Daniel frowned, trying to decipher her meaning. "You want us to go there? Why?" She didn't answer, but instead began walking briskly toward the plateau, her movements resolute. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before following. "I really hope you know what you're doing," he muttered under his breath. As they climbed the rocky slope, Daniel noticed something strange about the plateau. The rocks seemed unnaturally smooth, their surfaces etched with faint, glowing symbols. When they reached the top, he saw what Naya had been leading them toward, a massive circular platform embedded into the ground. It looked ancient, its surface covered in more of the glowing symbols that had become all too familiar. "What is this place?" Daniel asked, marveling at the sheer scale of the platform. It pulsed faintly beneath their feet, as if it were alive, waiting for something, or someone, to activate it. Naya stepped to the center of the platform and placed her hands on a glowing symbol. The ground beneath them vibrated, and the symbols began to light up one by one, forming intricate patterns that radiated outward. Daniel stumbled slightly, steadying himself as a deep hum filled the air. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rising with alarm. "Is this another obelisk?" Naya turned to him, her expression calm but serious. She pointed to him, then to the platform, and then to the sky. Daniel's heart sank as realization dawned. This is a beacon, isn't it? You're calling for help." She nodded, her gaze steady. Daniel's mind raced. "Help from who?" "Your people, the same ones who tried to kill you." Naya hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering with something that looked almost like regret. She pointed to the distant horizon, where the enemy machines were approaching, then back to the platform. Her meaning was clear. There was no other choice. Daniel swallowed hard. "All right, let's do this. But if this goes sideways..." He trailed off, shaking his head. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew the risks. The hum of the platform grew louder, and a beam of light shot upward into the sky, piercing through the morning haze. The energy around them crackled, making the hairs on Daniel's arms stand on end. For a moment, nothing happened. The desert was silent, save for the approaching machines whose red eyes were now visible at the base of the plateau. Then the air above them shimmered, and a massive ship emerged from the clouds. It was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen, sleek and angular, with glowing lines of energy running along its surface. The sight of it took his breath away, but Naya remained stoic, her gaze fixed on the ship as it descended slowly, casting a shadow over the plateau. A section of the ship opened, and a group of alien figures stepped out. They were similar to Naya, their features sharp and elegant, their eyes glowing faintly. But their expressions were wary, their postures tense. Daniel could feel the weight of their distrust as they approached. One of them stepped forward, his armor more ornate than the others. He looked at Naya, speaking in their language, his tone laced with both respect and suspicion. Naya replied calmly, gesturing to Daniel and the weapon he carried. The exchange grew more heated, their voices rising as the leader's gaze hardened. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "What's going on?" he whispered. "Are they here to help or—" Naya turned to him, her expression firm. She pointed to the leader, then to Daniel, and made a motion as if to say, "Show them." "Show them what?" Daniel asked, confused. She gestured to the weapon, then placed her hand over his chest, where the strange energy seemed to pulse faintly. He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's hope this works." Daniel stepped forward, holding the weapon out in front of him. The alien leader watched him intently, his glowing eyes narrowing. Daniel took a deep breath and focused, willing the weapon to activate. To his relief, it responded immediately, glowing brightly as energy pulsed through it. The leader's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face. He said something to Naya, who nodded solemnly. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, the leader knelt, followed by the rest of the aliens. The gesture was unmistakable. Submission. "What just happened?" Daniel asked, looking to Naya for an explanation. She smiled faintly, her glowing eyes softening as she placed a hand on his shoulder. She gestured to him, then to the aliens, then to the sky, as if to say, "You are one of us now." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of the enemy machines climbing the plateau broke the moment. The leader rose quickly, barking orders to his men. They moved with precision, forming a defensive line around the platform. Naya stepped beside Daniel, her gaze steady. "This isn't over," Daniel said, gripping the weapon tightly. "But at least we're not alone anymore." Naya nodded, her expression resolute. Together, they turned to face the oncoming threat, the rising sun casting long shadows across the battlefield. For the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. The fight was far from over, but he and Naya had forged a fragile alliance, and with it, the promise of a future worth fighting for.